Good evening, everyone. We would like to thank you and welcome you to our call tonight. I would like to remind you that you are in listen-only mode at the beginning of this call. Please, if you have questions, to type them into the chat box as we will answer them from the chat box. And with that brief reminder, I will turn it over to SORA President Ruth Price Rollins to begin our program.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending tonight's virtual town hall meeting. I am Ruth Price Rollins, and I greet you as the president of the Greater Cleveland Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Welcome to this very important event that is being hosted by our social action and our physical and mental health committees. We hope that this dialogue with community leaders provides you with information that will help you to cope with and to understand the government's role in eradicating the pandemic of racism. It is indeed a health crisis. From COVID-19 to interactions with law enforcement, racism continues to cost lives and damage our communities. So I'm going to take a moment to establish some ground rules for the discussion. While we're looking to create an environment where everyone can feel very open to express their feelings and their concerns, we also appreciate the fact that these discussions are likely to trigger different and very powerful emotions. So we're just asking for all of our participants to conduct themselves with openness and with respect. So let's not have any inappropriate language, and I'm sure that that's not going to happen, or any ill-willed comments. We're going to keep everything as positive as we can, and no personal attacks, because we don't want to have to remove you from this town hall meeting. So at this time, I thank you for being here. I hope that you learn a lot, and I will turn it over to our committees to introduce tonight's speakers. Good evening.
President Rollins, thank you for setting the ground rules for this discussion. Thank you all for joining in. I have the pleasure of introducing my co-moderator, Dr. Pamela Jones Fletcher. Dr. Pamela Jones Fletcher received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Kent State University, where she was also initiated into the Epsilon Nu chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. After graduation, Pamela obtained her doctorate degree from the Wright State University School of Professional Psychology. Dr. Fletcher?
Sorry, I would also like to take the time to introduce our other co-moderator for this evening, Meredith Turner. Meredith Turner received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Chicago State University and also earned her master's degree in education from Cleveland State University. She was initiated into the Greater Cleveland Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta. Meredith also serves on the sorority's National Social Action Committee. We will now also introduce our panelists. I have the pleasure of first introducing Dr. Tiffany Munford-Dent. Dr. Dent is a licensed psychologist. She is also the author of 4 books: Girls Got Issues, A Woman's Guide to Self-Discovery and Healing, You Got This, A Girl's Guide to Growing Up, Black Girl Unapologetically, and Reclaiming Me, Beginning My Journey to Overcoming Human Trafficking. And as a side note, these books are free to download to therapists who work with teen survivors. Dr. Dent has served on several national, state, and local board committees addressing sexual violence prevention and intervention, as well as emotional wellness of girls and women. Dr. Dent is the owner of Mumford-Dent Consulting and Psychological Services, LLC, through which she provides ongoing mental health consultation and assessment. Dr. Mumford Dent is also a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. So we thank you, Dr. Dent, for being a part of this call tonight. Meredith.
Natoya J. Walker Minor serves the City of Cleveland as Chief for the Public Affairs Cluster. The Public Affairs Cluster is comprised of 6 departments that concentrate on human capital, aging, civil service, human resources, public health, the Office of Equal Opportunity and Workforce Development. Essential to the role is leveraging resources and optimizing intersections between departmental disciplines and the private and philanthropic sectors. This work enables her to work within her passion, investing in vibrant and healthy communities. Chief Walker Minor is a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and is a proud graduate of the Cleveland Public Schools. Welcome, Chief Walker Minor, and thank you for joining us for this important conversation. Ward 6 Councilman Blaine A. Griffin represents one of Cleveland's most diverse wards, encompassing the East Side neighborhoods of Fairfax, Larchmere, Little Italy, Woodland Hills, and parts of Buckeye Shaker, University Circle, North Broadway, Slavic Village, and Union Miles. Councilman Griffin is chairman of Council's Health and Human Services Committee and sits on 4 other committees: Development, Planning and Sustainability, Finance, Workforce and Community Benefits and Operations. Prior to serving on council, Councilman Griffin had been executive director of the city's Community Relations Board for 11 years. Welcome, Councilman Griffin and panelists. Dr. Fletcher, take it away.
Thank you again for that. And let's just jump right in. We have a lot of great information to share with you all tonight, and we're really excited to have a really thorough and wonderful discussion. So, Dr. Dent, I'm going to start with you. And can you just jump right in and tell us and help us understand what is racism?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I think one of the things as we unpack this definition of racism, we also are learning that even Merriam-Webster's dictionary is recognizing that how we simplistically have been defining it has allowed for many people to not define it correctly and use it incorrectly in situations such as when people say a Black person is racist because of that focus on that simplistic definition that even Merriam-Webster's is saying their goal is always to be simplistic, but this is very nuanced and it has to be taken within a context. So in the basic simplistic piece, before we get into that extra power piece, is this belief that there is a group of people based on race that are superior or inferior solely based upon that. And there's value placed upon those who are viewed as superior. One of the things that has happened with racism, specifically in the United States, as well as even when we're going outside and looking into other nations, is that colonization, which is kind of white people, white Europeans and white Americans going across the globe and taking over parts of those countries and taking other resources, is that what has been determined to be superior is whiteness. And so anything that goes outside of whiteness is viewed as other. So if you think about when something is normal and everything else is other, there does lead into this whole idea of there is superiority in what is considered the norm. So on the next slide, part of what happened in trying to unpack this is that in looking at the simplistic definition by just race and viewing it as superior, people at times have been able to take that not full definition and be able to say, if I say something like, you know, I'm unapologetically Black. You know, I love Blackness. I think it's amazing. People say you're racist because you're saying that they are taking that as meaning I'm viewing myself as superior. The issue, however, is that we try to separate systemic racism from racism, but racism, by the nature of what it is, which is that superiority, adding the power piece to it, means that racism is systemic racism, because it's not just about identifying this as superiority or the norm. It is that added piece then that informs policies and practices, the government and other institutions, that then allows it to not just be, I think that I am the norm and that you are othered, but in that everything, every policy, all the institutions, all of those things end up meaning that when you come into contact with them, you're going to be viewed as less than. And so it's this idea of superiority plus power. And so sometimes we confuse racism, because we're looking at that simplistic definition, with what is viewed as prejudices. So prejudice could be that, yeah, I don't like these groups of people because, but racism is when we make it systemic and we add that power piece to it. And it allows it at times to be weaponized against communities specifically of color because you are now outside of the norm. So I think that's that piece of it, is that we've tried so long to just make racism just about race, but you have to add that power piece, because then this is how it shows up. So on the next slide, we talk about systemic racism impacts where we live. This is that piece of it, because if you're othered, where you're able to live, we get pushed into certain areas. And usually we have situations where the more we come into an area, the more other things leave, because now this community is less valuable. It's now othered versus the norm. And so even in part of that, access happens. We have, the more the other moves in and that superiority piece happens, the more the businesses move out. The more the devaluing of our homes happens, because they're now othered. You're no longer encompassing this, what we view as superior or more worthy. The jobs we have access to. We know that when we go into places, we hear that you have to be 10 times better because you're other. Because automatically you're a step down because you do not fit what is the norm. It shows up even in access to wealth, because when we have systemic racism and we've been othered for so long, we don't have generational wealth. We also are less likely to get loans or loans at better rates because, again, I'm taking a chance on you because you're other. Our interaction with the police and over-policing because we are outside of the norm. And then that access to education. We know that part of education is funding. So when we have our communities and we're othered and it automatically devalues where we live once we are the majority. They had that, I think it was in Maryland, when they compared to communities, and the only difference was the color of the people who lived there. And the homes in the Black community were devalued because they were not white people living in them. So then when we look at access to education, we know that a lot of the funding happens based upon the value of your homes in that community. So if we're othered and devalued already, systemically, we're dealing with that. And then even how our children are treated within those environments, that they are often looked at as not being given as much chances and grace, and that it's framed from this piece of you are outside the norm. So this is kind of what we need to look at when we're framing racism. It is systemic. You can't separate those two pieces out, because what gives it power is that power in what does othering and superiority mean.
Thank you, Dr. Dent, for that very rich definition of systemic racism and racism in general. I think that's just such a powerful frame that you're setting so that we have a better understanding of what racism is and what it looks like. So I would like to pull in our other two panelists and just kind of continue to go in this vein of systematic racism. And if the panelists can kind of share their thoughts of what systematic racism specifically looks like from the Black experience, maybe even again from the Black experience of Cleveland, and just share a little bit more of your thoughts. Dr. Den, if you would like to start, and then our other panelists, if you want to chime in.
I think the thing is that I think within Cleveland, we see all of these pieces. We know that we are over-policed, and then there's justification for that, over-surveilled. We also see within our communities, the more we move in, the more industry moves out, the more our homes become devalued. We see in our poverty rates. We see even in this time when we're talking about what essential employment looks like, we are running into this piece of we are a lot of times essential employees, but not the ones that are valued because of the jobs that we have had access to. So I think we see them in all those areas. We know about the disproportionate suspensions and expulsions. There's national studies on that and how that ends up impacting our communities of color, specifically our Black communities. So it's Cleveland is not, Cuyahoga County is not immune to this. We can try, and usually the people who say we are the people who are not experiencing this on a daily basis, who are centered, who are deemed closer to the norm.
Councilman?
Any specific order?
No, go right ahead.
Okay. So, you know, we live in a society right now where people have a sense of urgency. There's a sense of urgency for change. That's why we watched the manifestation of the civil unrest that we witnessed a few weeks ago in the city of Cleveland and across America. So when you talk about racism, I'll give you specific examples of how it is manifested in the city of Cleveland and has disproportionately made Black people sick, and in a lot of cases has killed Black people and African Americans. It goes from 400 years of slavery to Jim Crow to the redlining epidemic, the redlining that we've seen, to what we see now, the new Jim Crow, where the mass incarceration, which we know left a lot of women, you know, raising children by themselves, when we have 75% of the city of Cleveland that are headed by single parent households. But I will tell you that I will start out with housing and what does it look like in housing and transportation and infrastructure and environment, something that we often leave out that I know that your Delta sister, Chanel Wiggum Smith, is very active in. You know, housing, we pass laws to deal with lead exposure. We know that trying to have good, safe, affordable housing is critical to raising a healthy family. Transportation, you can look how it manifests itself with the jobs that go to inner ring to outer ring suburbs. And oftentimes the bus systems and transportation systems are not in place to get people to the right jobs. The digital divide, which is something that COVID-19 has illuminated, because 2/3 of the homes in the city of Cleveland don't have access to high-speed broadband. And when you look at how that creates disparity, that's where the Industry 4.0 is at. That's where the new jobs are going to take place. That's how people do healthcare. Not only do people do their education on there, people are actually providing healthcare. We had to quarantine and self-isolate. So if you wanted to check on a loved one that was above 60 or 70 years old, you often needed this tool in order to do that. So not having the digital tools that we need. So that's number one. Number two is education. I won't repeat what Dr. Dent said. I think she was right on point, but that disruption of the pipeline from birth to adulthood is disrupted by racism. The health disparities. I serve an area, the Woodland Hills area, where it's Morris Black, Woodland Hills, that has the lowest life expectancy of the entire county and 20 years less than some of their affluent suburban counterparts like Lyndhurst. We have women, Black women, and I sometimes get the stats wrong, but it's at least 5 or 6 times more likely, even if they have a higher degree of education than their white counterparts, that are losing babies before the age of 1 and have a tremendous infant mortality rate. Buckeye, the area that you guys have your headquarters in, is one of those areas. So we have tremendous amount of health disparities, the social determinants of health that has caused Black people to have so much trauma and stress that it creates high blood pressure and diabetes and all of the other issues that go with that. Let's mention economic mobility and wealth creation, which we know that the gap is continuing to widen between Black and white. And then, you know, we always talk about police reform, but I think we need to really talk about comprehensive criminal justice reform. Who gets locked up? Not just from police, but also who gets locked up. Are there systems in place like the arbitrators that protect police when they do wrong and actually get them back on the job even if they get fired? The judicial system. You know, it's racism all embedded in the judicial system, that you would look at Black people are incarcerated and receive harsher penalties for things like marijuana. And that's one of the reasons why we passed decriminalization of marijuana, which is a bill that I introduced. And a lot of people ask, well, is that because you're encouraging everybody to get high? No, because it's an unfair system. And Black folks were 8 times more likely than their white counterparts to get charged for low-level misdemeanor crimes for marijuana possession, which will stop them from getting access to school loans at the federal level, hurt them from getting access to social services that they may need, other tools that they may need, but most of all, being gainfully employed and getting a job. So when you look at racism, it cuts across all of these different systems, and it's an action that people do to a specific group of people, which happens to be Black folks. And let's be honest, it's been government-led for many years. So we declared racism a public health crisis in the city of Cleveland. And the reason that we declared racism a public health crisis in the city of Cleveland is because we need to look at the legislation and what tools we need to make us a 21st century city. I will also tell you in closing, as I turn over to my esteemed friend and colleague, Latoya Walker Minor, that it cannot just be the city of Cleveland alone. We have to examine the corporate community, the boardrooms, the philanthropic areas. Where are they investing? All of these different folks have a responsibility in order for us to be the city that we need to be. So I'm committed to this work. It's not an easy task. I'm glad that the Deltas and the fine women, you know, what is the saying? Oh, what it means to be a Delta girl. I'm proud that you guys are taking this issue on, because we really need your voice and help in this conversation. And I just like to thank you, and especially my sister Marilyn and the other co-host, Miss Dr. Jones, for having me and sharing the passion that I have for this. Thank you so much.
I too, sorors, want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this esteemed panel and to talk with Dr. Dent and Councilman Griffin. I just kind of want to open with a line from the great poets, the Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five in 1982, to tell you how racism is so connected to mental health. Their main line was, "Don't push me because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under." If you look at the lyrics of that song, if you look at what the social determinants of health are, housing, transportation, education, workforce, all the things that systematic racism is a part of, that we deal with on a regular basis every day, are the things that contribute to toxic health and toxic stress, and how toxic stress completely is aligned to mental health stressors, completely aligned to it. And it's not new. Racism as a public health issue is not new. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois said it in 1903 in The Soul of Black Folks. He talked about it when he said that sickness and health are largely a part of where people live. The concept of place matters. The concept of place matters came out about 15 years ago. So where we live geographically, because of racism, again, contributing to the toxic stressors, because we did not have the mobility that we chose to have. Redlining still exists sometimes today. So when we talk about, when the councilman and the mayor talk about the declaration of public health as of racism as a public health crisis, it's really looking at the systemic challenges that continue to perpetuate and to feed into the psychological stressors, the toxic stressors that we continue to have to deal with in our community. In our community, if a mom, whether she's a single mom or a married mom, if she can only get a job in Solon and she has to catch 6 buses 82 minutes. We conducted a study a few years ago, one way to her job. That means she has to get up super early to get those kids together. Can you imagine that stress? And if one of those children becomes ill? So when we're talking about the systems, why are those employment locations so far out in the outer rings? We're talking about systemic analysis. That's what the councilman is talking about, and that's what those of us that are highly engaged in this conversation are talking about, so that we can get to the point where we have not only access to education, but access to workforce, so that people can care for themselves. Because economic mobility is completely tied to the capability to be skilled, to be trained. That's why we're proclaiming this racism as a public health challenge. Place does matter. Where grocery stores are located. Think about it. Think about it. Think about where you have a full service grocery store inside the city of Cleveland. I challenge you to list one, a full service grocery store with quality produce and quality meat. We're talking about systems and how we redirect those sources into the central city, because they continue to perpetuate the racism through institutionalism and policies that we deal with, that a professor of mine said years ago, they're so velvetized, they feel so good, we don't even recognize it until we're in the midst of it. And that is why we have to drill down as a community, as a sorority, as a people, as an individual, to really examine these policies, to challenge them, and to work with those in elected office and corporate Cleveland to make the change. We are the ones that we've been waiting for, and the time is now.
Thank you all for your thoughts around this this health crisis, this huge issue, and just the multi-layers that go into how it is impacting our community as well as other communities of color. But again, especially how just how complex it is. It's not something as simple, again, as you were talking about earlier, Dr. Dennis, about power. And it's about, again, how that power differential impacts us in so many ways that we probably don't even think about. So as we talk a little bit more, and you all have kind of mentioned this, and we talk about, again, the impact of racism. Dr. Dunham, I'm going to go back to you and just talk a little bit more about, again, this historical trauma of racism and its generational impact, specifically on our mental, physical, and emotional health within the Black community, because you've all kind of touched upon that. Can we dig a little deeper and talk about that?
Absolutely. I think the first thing that we need to understand is that this is our lived experience. Although we are grateful that it is heightened in this moment, this is not, how people say we're not new to this. This has been the experience of Black folks in the United States since Black folks came to the United States, in terms of these systems being set up that are attempt to marginalize and oppress us. And so in the next slide, you can skip the next one, but after that, on the historical and transgenerational, one of the things that we know, there was actually a study that talked about epigenetics. Fancy word. I was like, oh, it's cool. But pretty much what it talks about is trauma being transmitted in your DNA. The stress hormones across generations. What the study initially was done on the descendants of Holocaust survivors, not the Holocaust survivors, not even their children, but their grandchildren. And what they were able to find was an increased level of a stress hormone from the fact of the stressors that their ancestors had experienced. And they said that we're learning that these things can be passed in your DNA. So I'm not surprised when Councilman Griffin talks about the 20-year difference between people in one of the areas of his district and more of a wealthier district, because we're carrying this. And I like to show this graphic because one of the things I always find interesting is that people will always say, for one, even if we took out epigenetics, they would say slavery was a long time ago. But then we need to look at how systemic racism continued to exist It just called itself something different. So we look at American slavery, then we get into segregation, and then we go into, the Jim Crow era, and now even in mass incarceration. Like, it's continued. It's just how we are choosing to marginalize and oppress Black folks has changed. And even when people are saying the civil rights era was long ago, or Jim Crow was long ago, and I'm like, that was my daddy for me. So, I have a daddy who's 80 years old. So we're sitting here. So my generation is impacted by this. And so we need to recognize that there is racial trauma in living while Black. And so as a psychologist, and we can go to the next slide, as a psychologist, for me, I come from that perspective when I'm dealing with Black people, to talk about what you're experiencing on a daily basis is trauma. When you're constantly othered, when you're constantly put in situations where you are devalued just by what you look like, when you are being called a thug just by nature of the color of your skin, like Tracy Blackman from the who's a minister, she talked about one time when people were saying that you just need to be less threatening. She said, but when your weapon is your Black skin, you can't take it off. And that is this framework that we're coming from. And so when we're looking at this racial trauma, we know that, as Councilman Griffin said, stress. This is stressful, to not be able to go to Starbucks without having the police call on you, to tell someone to chain up their dog because they're supposed to in a park, and they weaponize that by calling the police and say you're threatening them because they know that it is likely that your interaction with the police is not going to end well for you. So these pieces of stress, and we also know that stress causes depression. It causes anxiety. We end up dealing with behavioral problems in our children because our children know they're being othered. They see it, and we can sit here all day and say, well, they're kids, but we know kids a lot of times are even more intuitive than we are. They're more connected, and they look for that because they're looking for that nurturing, and they see that they're being marginalized. And then I like to talk about rage. And this idea for me is that rage is helplessness plus anger. That we have this feeling sometimes of this system has been going on for 400 years, and every day when something happens, I'm angry and it's not changing. Low self-esteem, because how long can you be othered? How long can you know that you're never going to meet this ideal that society has set for you, that no matter how good you are, that you're likely to be overlooked for a job, that when you move into a community, that community is now saying that their property values are going to go down because you've shown up. My own kids went to a school and parents were talking about our children because we started to have an influx of Black parents, even though we have higher educations and job positions than the white families who live there. So those type of things we're going to deal with. And then we end up wondering, when we're struggling with concentration, we can't focus. And for our children in school, that ends up allowing them to be othered and penalized even more, because you're sitting there and you're struggling to exist while Black and deal with this trauma, and nobody's really acknowledging it. And then we also know that there was a study by Emory University, and they looked at Black and Latina women across socioeconomic categories. So sort of like when Councilman Griffin was saying, doesn't really matter how much money you got. Black women are impacted. And they looked at those with and without insurance, college degrees, whether they had access to food and information, and they were still significantly more likely to have elevated stress hormones and conditions in those that set hormones in action, which made them more likely, as they were talking about, to deliver children early. To have children of low birth weight. And then we know that that's one of the reasons, and Emory University was able to talk about that approximately 30,000 Black babies are born prematurely each year than any other group. So we also know that even within that stress is more likely to contribute to other health issues, diabetes. It causes autoimmune issues. The Black Women's Health Imperative talked about how we're more likely to have an increased chance of lupus and high blood pressure and some of these other health issues that contribute to our mortality. When COVID happened and people were saying, well, Black people are getting sicker, it's because of y'all. It's because of systemic racism. The lack, Natoya was talking about in terms of grocery stores. You don't have access to fresh food. When we're sitting here and we're talking about that the only transportation you have is 82 minutes to take a bus somewhere, and the stress of that, and then when we talk about social distancing and you cannot, healthcare being readily available in your community, and even the tendency, as we know from Serena Williams, she even talked about it, that the belief that Black women specifically have a higher tolerance for pain, which means we're often not believed when we go to the doctor. So we have these issues that this lack of health care, the lack of preventative care, all of these things are trauma. And how are we as a people going to be able to actually deal with it? And so in this moment, next slide, we know that even though we deal with this on a daily basis, it is amplified for us because we are people. We deal with trauma on a daily basis, but there are these moments where it's heightened. We're bombarded with trauma images. I understand that one of the reasons that people are beginning to believe our lived experiences is because we're taping them for ourselves. Us talking about them didn't make you believe them. You actually, because you were able to say, well, you must be missing something. And so you're now rewinding the tape over and over and over again to verify you're not missing anything. And then you're realizing this is truly our lived experience. But in that, we as Black people are having to witness Black death, because we are the ones who are having to videotape, like Darnella did with George Floyd. A teenage girl had to stand there because she knew that she needed to videotape that and witness Black death in order for the world to really believe that we experience these traumas. And then we're also being expected to be there for those who are claiming a goal of allyship. We tired, we're traumatized, and yet people are saying, talk to us more about this. Let me show you this more. Look more at Black death. Talk more about Black death. Talk more about racial trauma. And then that having to justify that we deserve not to die. I always say it's privilege is not having, when people are killed by police or killed by citizens, we have to prove we didn't deserve to die. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not that you have to justify killing me. I have to justify that I didn't deserve to be killed. And that's that part of being other. And then we are demanding to be the expert in this moment for everybody without compensation, whether we want to or not. And then there's an isolation due to trauma not being acknowledged, because some of us, the day after Breonna Taylor was killed, the day after George Floyd was killed, the day after Ahmaud Arbery was killed, today would have been the 18th birthday for Tamir Rice, the day after Tamir Rice was killed. Many of us went to work and were met with silence. No one even acknowledged the trauma that we are experiencing. So in this moment, we know that it's amplified. And how do we as a community acknowledge it is not, it is what it is? Because existing in a constant state of stress and trauma, we're seeing it in our DNA, we're seeing it in our physical health, we're experiencing it in our emotional health, and we have to allow ourselves this space and this time to be able to do better and expect better.
And if I could just chime in, and I think that one of the things that Dr. Den is talking about is because we were all nationally as a country at home. See, this whole thing was not about George Floyd. This was about a country of Black folk being exhausted. That's what this is about. And so when friends of mine that are white ask, why George Floyd, it wasn't George Floyd. It was the tipping point. It was the tipping point on a parallel track of COVID. Because if you go back to before May 25th, before the murder, right? The murder of George Floyd. Before that, people in this country were saying, it's unbelievable. Where do these health disparities come from? Right? But those were other people, not the people that are being othered. But we are, as the othered people, we're not surprised because we've known about health disparities for 75 years, for almost 100 years. I indicated that Dr. Du Bois wrote that in 1903, right? In 1980, the leadership at Morehouse Medical School in Meharry under Reagan came out with the Office of Minority Health for this country. That's 35 years ago. We've known about health disparities. So who was sleeping? Who wasn't woke, right? But because 95% of every American was at home, you couldn't run away from it. And because you couldn't run away from it, and we were already dealing with the stressors of COVID-19 and its impact on us, the reluctance of health departments nationally to release the data, the demographic data, right? So we're dealing with that, and we're looking at our loved ones dying because of health disparities that we've known about for a very long time, and boom, there's a tipping point. And everyone watched it. So you could not run away from it because it was on every telephone, it was on every social media. And so it's not an accident. I do not believe that it was an accident that the Creator allowed those two things to happen simultaneously, so we could dig deep to really justify the look at systems. Because Councilman Griffin and others like him in his seat in Cleveland and across this country, we have been talking about racism as a public health crisis. This now gives us a platform for which is undeniable in corporate Cleveland and corporate any place, because the facts are there and there for everybody to witness.
So if I could just kind of follow up on what Chief Walker Minor said, you know, where do we go from here? We know that racism is the root cause of all of these issues that we talked about. And I just want to tell you personally, I try to be one of those type of politicians that not complain about an issue or talk about an issue. What are we going to do about an issue? And one thing about calling this what it is, a public health crisis, and first of all, identifying it and having the largest institution in town, the city government, state that racism is a problem, that racism is a public health crisis, reminds me of a movie that I once saw, The Usual Suspects, with a guy named Kaiser Permanente. And he said something that I'll never forget. He said, the biggest trick that the devil ever played on the world is to convince it that he never existed. And that's what some people try to do. They make it seem like racism doesn't exist. So the first thing we did is wanted to call it out. The next thing we want to do is, when you declare something a public health crisis, you now have a responsibility to eliminate it or mitigate the public health crisis. You look at it just like you would look at the flu, just as you would look at any other epidemic, any other pandemic, anything that we do, look at it from a public health lens. And how do we put a systemic approach to deal with the things that we need in place? Ladies and gentlemen, I would tell you, just as I just chime in and tell you where we want to go from here, never waste a good crisis. Never waste a good crisis. And one thing right now, we have to recognize that we cannot stay in the perpetual state that we're in, that we have to come out of these two pandemics that have converged upon our society and have manifested in what we're seeing now. And we actually have to be a 21st century city and do things different. We actually have to put the policies and the pieces in place across the board. And I will tell you, it is not going to be easy. We cannot have 380,000 people in the city of Cleveland come to the table and have a conversation about it, because then that's all it would be, is a conversation. So we're going to identify key organizations, and I want to take a note from Danielle Sidnor, the president of the NAACP, with something that she said a couple of weeks ago that I think was just a brilliant line. She said, find your space in this work. The one thing I enjoy about being a council person is that I'm not asked to be an expert about one thing, like Dr. Dent could probably give you guys a class on this, which I'm listening to her and I'm learning as we go. But also, you know, you're asked to know a little bit about everything. And one of the things that we want to do is, we're not asking everybody to be an expert on race, and everybody, you know, to Dr. Dent's point, everybody to be an expert on health disparities, everybody to be an expert on housing. But there's people of color that understand each of those scenarios: education, wealth creation, jobs, transportation, environment, all of the things that we're talking about that are, impacted by the root cause of racism, that there are experts that can help us put the policies in place, not only as a city, but as a corporate community and philanthropic community to have a better quality of life in Cleveland. Listen, everybody, people want to see, feel, and touch and hear change in their community. People are tired of academic exercises and, speeches that wax poetic. In government, there's an old saying that you can you can do politics and poetry, but you have to govern in prose. And that's what we're doing right now. We're trying to govern in prose. And with the help of you all, I think that we can put some concrete steps in place in order to really try to make some fundamental change in our community.
So far, the resolutions have been passed or are under consideration in Hamilton, Franklin, Cuyahoga, Montgomery, and Summit counties, and in cities like Cleveland and Columbus. And the Ohio General Assembly conducted a hearing last week on a bill that would declare racism as a public health crisis. So again, now that we have a better understanding and some context around how African Americans experience and are impacted by racism, Councilman Griffin, can you speak to us again about the urgency of this moment and the pattern developing across the country in terms of legislative and governmental bodies adopting resolutions to declare racism as a public health crisis? And can you tell us a little bit about when you draft a resolution of this magnitude, what does that really mean? What was that process like for you and your colleagues as you unanimously condemned racism as a public health crisis?
So, I'm a type of person that believes in collaborative leadership. And as much as my faith guides my Christian background and my faith in Christ and, my belief in messianic leadership, I don't believe that any one of us are messianic leaders. And I believe that if we're going to be successful, we have to do it as a collaborative leadership model. So the first thing that I did is I didn't try to keep this just in City Hall and the walls of 601 Lakeside so that we could have a discussion amongst ourselves. We had partners, Margaret Mitchell from the YWCA, Marsha Maccabee from the Urban League, Danielle Sidnor from the NAACP, Helen Forbes from the United Way, who had already been working and putting together an equity group, along with Cecil Lipscomb from the United Black Fund. We had the first year Cleveland that really came out and worked with us. So we didn't try to do this just as council and just by ourselves. We went out and got the people that's been on the front line with those legacy civil rights organizations and groups that work with poverty and work with these entrenched social constructs to help us establish this. So that's number one. What I found is people don't want you to just draft a piece of legislation and say, here, jump on board, follow the Pied Piper. People want to be involved in the construction. They want to have a meaningful part in the discussion. So it's imperative upon us to try to put a process in place where everybody can be a part of the discussion, but no one person and no one institution can dominate the discussion. The other thing that I will tell you is that I was very proud that the Greater Cleveland Partnership, unanimously, all 75 board members voted in favor of this, which is like very rarely happens. The first call I got when we passed this legislation was from Dr. Tommy Mihaljevic from Cleveland Clinic to say, hey, we support this, we're on board. So right now, more than 40 organizations at last count have put in support for this resolution. And once again, that speaks volumes because everybody is now saying we have to do something. Listen, as horrible as everything was a couple of weeks ago, I do not condone the damage to person or property. I believe in the right to protest. I believe in the right to disrupt, but I don't believe that anybody should damage or harm a person or property. And as much as you all might have seen the buildings and the cars on fire down there, there were actually also people, human beings, protesters, as well as innocent bystanders that were hurt by people from all sides because of the melee that took place. So the reason I say that to you is because the thing that the couple weeks did is it made the community recognize that it's an awakening and that folks are tired. And like Fannie Lou Hamer said, sick and tired of being sick and tired. I've talked to all of those other cities that you've mentioned, and we're all trying to work together. We're actually looking at how we could do some joint efforts in order to be supportive. And then when you're talking about the state legislature, as I close, is another example of racism. The reason that they can't get anything through the legislature is because of the horrible gerrymandering that has taken place that people need to put in place in order to have political power at the state house. So you can't even have a constructive conversation about issues that are important, especially to the urban core and Black folks, because of the gerrymandering and because racism has manifested itself at the state house. So we're working with these other cities. Everybody has to do it their own separate way, because in Cleveland, we have done some things. Chief Walker Minor may not mention it, but she was very instrumental in pulling together a community benefits agreement. The lead exposure, which was a historical piece of legislation to say that everybody has to have a certificate to say that their home is lead safe in order, to rent it out to a family. The marijuana decriminalization. We've already made several steps. Other cities have made several steps as well. Now what our job is, how do we tie it all together so that we're all speaking and rowing in the same direction? And that's what we're attempting to do as government right now. Because there have been people working in this already, and we just trying to bring everybody together to try to make sure that we have a better quality of life in Cleveland.
Okay. So as we move into the last half hour of our discussion, I want to ask one last question before we take questions from our audience. And Dr. Dent, Chief Walker Minor, Councilman Griffin, in that order, feel free to respond. So advocacy through the vehicle of social action, such as calling or writing elected officials, marching and protesting, as we have seen as of late, are all ways that we can fight racism and have a healthy outlet to express our emotions. What are some other suggestions might you have for people who are feeling a great deal of emotional pain and trauma and need constructive outlets or healthy ways to take care of their emotional and mental health? And I know that, drafting a piece of legislation, it's great and it's meeting the needs, but what else can we offer our constituents?
I think the first thing for me is there is this quote by Audre Lorde, and she says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. I think first, when we're talking about emotional, mental health in this time of racial trauma and stress, we have to recognize that taking moments for ourselves, it's not stepping away. It is an act of self-preservation. We can only fight so long without taking care of ourselves in these moments, without falling apart. And so, as it says in the next slide, so we have to look at self-care is resistance, because we're always talking about resist. It is resistance. When you're taking care of yourself, you're resisting allowing all of the racial trauma, the experience of living while Black, to end up causing such a level of stress that you can't go on. And so self-care is this revolutionary act. So one of the things I've been constantly asked in this time, because we feel guilty when we don't go to a protest. We feel guilty at times when we don't watch the video. So I said, when we look at self-care is resistance, on the next slide, it talks about some ways that you can activate those resistance. And for those who are watching, yes, the ladies of Delta Sigma Theta have these slides for you, so they will be able to get them to you as it relates to these. So take a break. So again, we're overload on social media. No one can be bombarded with trauma and survive emotionally or even physically, because we know stress impacts us physically. Don't feel obligated. Others will suddenly, again, want you to educate them. It's okay to tell them that Google can be their friend, that at some point I can be here for some questions, but do some of the work for yourself. Seek mental health services. I'm a psychologist. I'm a psychologist for the culture is what I always say. So you owe it to yourself. A lot of times in our community, we do not seek out mental health services. We are experiencing trauma. We are going through it, and we do not seek out services. So if you are feeling anxious, depressed, or overwhelmed, that's what we're here for. The next one is find Black spaces. At points in times, you don't want to explain your experience. You just want to be in a space where other people understand it. And so that allows for those moments of vulnerability, because as Black people living in a world where we're othered, we oftentimes don't believe we have the right to be vulnerable because how that will be used against us. We need to understand that resistance is multifaceted, and I will do what that looks like in this next slide. So choose your lane or lanes, and that's okay. Allow yourself moments of rest. Your body, your mind, you need it. And this one, there is, even though 400 years of being here, 400 years of being other, there is still Black joy. I am always saying, I'm going to have my moments of Black joy. I'm going to dance. I'm going to sing. I'm going to commune with people in my community. I'm not going to deny myself those joyful experiences of that Blackness. And so in the next slide, when we talk about what is this multifaceted resistance, because I've had people calling me like, I just can't march today and I feel horrible. There are other ways to also engage, and these are just a few of them. Protest. For some do not choose to hear you until they see you. We know for some in these moments, the reasons why people are listening is because they're seeing people in the streets. So protesting is a revolutionary act. Vote. Even with gerrymandering, part of the reason that gerrymandering has been able to happen is because who's elected at the time that they're able to redraw the districts. It allows those who are elected to know that they need to serve your interests. They're not listening to you if you're not voting, because you're not the one helping them keep their job. And once you put them in office, attend the meetings of your city government. Hold those people accountable who you've elected. Let them know that I didn't just vote, I'm now watching to see if you're doing what you're supposed to do. Mentor Black children. We talked a little bit earlier about low self-esteem and anxiety and all those things because our Black kids are living while Black and being other. So it allows us to combat those belief systems that society attempts to ingrain in them, that tells them that they're not worthy, that they cannot achieve, that they're not good enough. So be that person who's helping them do that. This next one is hard. Serve on juries when you receive the call. Earlier, I think it was Councilman Griffin talked about it's not just the police system, it's the entire justice system. And part of that justice system is when you are othered and when you are going in front of the court and when there are juries being able to decide your innocence or guilt and are making recommendations on what happens to you, if you don't look like them, they are othering you. And so part of it is we need to be there in those rooms to be a voice and to not let this racism, these belief systems about superiority and not giving grace, not be given to the people in our community. Councilman Griffin mentioned this as well when he was talking about when they came into the room to make these decisions, they brought in organizations that are doing the work. So even if you are tired, support those community organizers, organizations serving the communities. They can't exist without financial backing. They can't exist without you signing whatever petitions they need. Support them. And then insist that companies have diverse leadership. Even as people are putting out statements about Black Lives Matter, one of the questions came up, thank you for making the statement. Can I see your board of directors? Can I see your senior leadership? So part of it is being at the table is a form of resistance. Because when you're in the room, you're part of that decision-making process. So for some of us, it's not necessarily being in the streets. I am an in the streets person. But for some people, it's not being in the streets. But we can't negate those of us in the community who are in city council, who are in the boardrooms at the Cleveland Clinic, who are at these tables and are bringing up these issues and are beginning to hold and have been holding people accountable for what's happening to Black folks here in not just Cleveland, but Cuyahoga County.
Chief Walker Minor.
There I am. I'll say ditto to everything that Dr. Dent said. Self-care is critical. We must do it. It is not a selfish choice. It is a choice for self. And we must absolutely take care of ourselves. So in addition to the multifaceted resistance that Dr. Dent just walked us through, pray, run, do yoga, walk, meditate, go swimming. Find that space where you can have a little talk with yourself or in your creator, whomever it is that you believe in, and get centered so that you can be prepared for the work. When we show up for the work, we have to show up ready. And if we show up tired, we can't deliver. Because if we deliver at anything less than 100%, we may as well not have come. And that is why self-care is critical. So you have to take that time to get into a space where you can think clearly, because if you don't, your body will remind you that you only have one temple and it will shut down, and you'll wonder why it's shutting down. And it's because literally you're physically and mentally and emotionally exhausted. So find that space, whether it's walking or running or skating or yoga, whatever it is. I, as a preacher's wife and a minister myself, I certainly encourage the power of prayer. Find that space. There are women's groups. Find women's groups outside of your norm. I try, as a preacher's wife, I look for women's group outside of those in my church that I can just be real and vulnerable with, that are not judgmental because they see me in a different light, a place where I can go and fully decompress for my own mental health, where I don't have to be on. So find that space so that when you're on, you're on. And here's the other thing, when we're protesting, get the facts, know the data. Because you cannot protest and be out there spewing out incorrect information, because the moment you do, you lose credibility.
So when you get on the airplane, the first thing they tell you is that even if you're riding with a baby, the first thing that they tell you, if this plane starts to go down, put the mask over your own face first. Before you go try to help anybody else, make sure you put the mask over your face first, even before you try to go help your kids, a baby, or anybody else. Being a council person is often an enormous responsibility. It's often overwhelming. You often see people who live on the margins of society. You have elderly people who have been abandoned, whose children have left. They live by themselves in isolation. A lot of times their only contact with the outside world, especially during the COVID-19 crisis, I found was me. And whether it was me delivering a bag of groceries, whether it was just me doing a wellness check, you got a lot of seniors that live in the city of Cleveland that have just been abandoned. And if it's anything, we should really look at those kind of things. But it's an enormous responsibility. And you couple that with watching a George Floyd, incident. I'm a former power forward that played basketball in Malone College in Canton, Ohio in high school. And had my own problems and interactions with the police throughout the years. And all I could think about is that could have been me, or that could have been one of my children. So when I had to deal with this enormous burden, like Chief Walker Minor said, I actually called my pastor, C.J. Matthews, and said, man, I just need you to pray for me, man. I'm overwhelmed. It's just crazy. But at the end of the day, it felt good to just be able to have that conversation with somebody. And oftentimes me and my peers had that conversation, because a lot of people depend on us for their livelihood, for a lot of things beyond just the legislation that we pass. A lot of people don't realize that about a council person, but we have to fill several different roles just to be there for the community. I would tell you that leadership is also dangerous. Let's be real. You're going to deal with some haters. You're going to deal with people who are going to not like what you do. I'll be honest with you. I'm not going to say any names, but I had a prominent pastor that called me and literally ripped me about the legislation because he felt it should be doing X, Y, Z, this, that, and everything else, even though about 60 to 70% of what he said, the city is already doing. But he just, he went in on me, and it was, it wasn't to say, hey, we support you, brother, and let me give you a nudge to try to help you. It was like, it was very, very, it added to the burden, not helped the burden. So let me just leave it at that. people in our community, when you talk about the enormous responsibility, Black folks, women especially, and I really feel bad for women because you have the awesome burden of trying to raise families. Oftentimes, I gave you the statistic about the single parent household. You know, we got more responsibilities than most people have to just operate in a day-to-day life that other people don't have to deal with. You know, just even the microaggressions that you have to deal with, you know, when you deal with people on a regular basis, when you're in environments that's not predominantly African American. I would tell people also that, you know, OWN is a very important network, and I want to mention that. I know Catrice Kane is very instrumental in that with First Year Cleveland, but our wellness network with Sabrina Roberts, Tracy Carter, Catrice Kane, and all of them have been really identifying and pulling together all of the Black psychologists, because we found that there's not nearly enough Black psychiatrists and psychologists that people can actually go get treatment from that can give culturally specific treatment and culturally specific, treatment, care for mental health. So that's an important initiative. Like I said, you have so many great initiatives going on in the city of Cleveland. The key is, how do we tie it all together so that people can touch, feel, and see the change and know that somebody's fighting on their behalf.
Blaine, didn't you want to talk about the mural right quick?
I'll be more than happy to talk about the mural. One of the proudest moments, and it's a small but significant, demonstration of a mural that we put on East 93rd, where we blocked off the streets. And we've had people that come far as from New York. We had 100 artists that came and put this Black Lives Matter mural. So even though it deals with police brutality, it also was put in the neighborhood where a lot of people said, well, you need to put it downtown. You know, once again, everybody has an opinion. You need to put it there. It's not vocal. Why are you putting it there? I'm glad we put it on East 93rd, because here's a corridor that had 5 women that we seen murdered, one a precious child, and only one of those murders have been solved. And this community has felt left behind and abandoned, like a lot of neighborhoods in the city of Cleveland. So I'm happy to say that Black Lives Matter on East 93rd between Union and Kinsman too. And, I'm proud of that. I'm proud to be the first in Cleveland. I know that people like to relegate it to the cause that they think is important, but this is what's important to our community. The community came to me and asked me to keep the street closed for an extended amount of time. I obliged. It is still closed till today. I would encourage all of you, because it is very inspirational and it is very emotional, to at least go and take a look at it, park on one of the side streets. We want to showcase our neighborhood, because a lot of these neighborhoods don't get the kind of attention. So Black Lives Matter on East 93rd Street too. And I'm just proud of that mural, not just because of the statement that it makes, but because of how it has brought a community together that has felt abandoned and disenfranchised for a long time. Thanks, Marilyn, for bringing that up.
Thank you, Councilman. Dr. Fletcher?
Thank you again, panelists, for this rich and wonderful discussion. I think we've talked about so many amazing things tonight. I want to have a chance to go to our participants and answer some of the, have you guys answer some of the questions that they posed here tonight with some of the time that we have remaining. So one of our first questions was, there's an educator who is a part of our discussion tonight who works with juvenile detained youth ages 9 to 18. Of all the factors that were discussed this evening are magnified with this population. She reported that she's too interested in working towards solutions. The disparity is very severe within this population and the numbers are great. There's a great disconnect when youth are educated. Can you share any mentoring programs that could possibly work for this population? Again, specifically those ages of 9 to 18.
I'll go first, since it's, whenever it's more than 3 seconds of silence, a politician would jump in. So just briefly, I come up in working. The reason I got into politics, if I could just tell you this brief personal story, is because I worked with gang affiliated youth that was referred to my program from at Harvard Community Services Center. Elaine Goldstein gave me a job, and my job was to deal with, I'm joking, but I'm not joking. I don't call them bad kids because there's no such thing as a bad kid, but mischievous little rascals. And some of them still stay in touch with me this day because I became like a father figure to them. And I just watched how their whole life was upside down. Their home life was horrible. They didn't get cared for right at school. They were in the justice system. And it seemed like the entire community and the entire system was letting them down. So I decided to get involved with politics because, like Dr. Dent said, I wanted to hold people accountable. I never thought that I would run myself. I just wanted to be part of the process to hold people accountable, to elect better judges, to get council people that cared about these young people. And I would tell you that one of the things that I come up and raise and what I used to teach the young people was the rites of passage concept, which is the Akan culture. And it is how you raise a child from a childhood to adulthood. I don't think we have enough culturally specific programs. And I would encourage anybody to read Paul Hill's book, Coming of Age. It's an older book, but it's a very good basic book. Paul is a mentor of mine, who we used to teach kids rites of passage. And it was about ceremonial, understanding their culture, understanding how to have focus, control, and patience, how we could just work on the basic tools to help rear a young person. And I've used that to raise my own children, and I've used it to mentor the 20s or hundreds of kids that I've mentored in the neighborhood too. And I would tell you, even the ones that went to jail still come back, and the first stop they make is to my house because they know I care for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is Tiffany, or Dr. Dan or whatever. A couple of things. I think the struggle is, I'm a psychologist. I work within the juvenile justice system. The problem is at times we think that addressing the needs of our juvenile justice involved youth is one layered. Mentoring programs are awesome. A couple that I've referred to have been Alpha Esquire and Kappa League. I love mentoring programs that are not paid mentorship. I'm not a fan of paid mentorship because you're clocking hours and you're leaving when your hours or contractor's over. So I usually refer to mentoring programs such as those two because it's a commitment that their organizations make, and that even if their members who are over that program change year to year, the program continues to exist. But I also think that we need to, sometimes we throw in mentoring as the solution when we're not looking at the fact of that our kids need jobs. We're not looking at the fact, and job opportunities, that we're not looking at the fact of how they're being treated in schools that result in them violating their probation because they're more likely to be suspended from school, or the school is more likely, because we're over-policed in our schools, that they're more likely to then have the police called on them and get charges that result in juvenile justice involvement anyway. We're not looking at the fact that a lot of times our kids, there's this model called the Good Lives model, which means a lot of times we are doing things that get things that you should want. You're just not going about them in the right way. Everybody wants financial stability. When you're in a community where there are not jobs, where your family is having to travel 82 minutes to be able to find employment, when you're seeing that the opportunities are not there, you end up at times seeking out financial stability in ways that do not work for you and to support your family. So we also have to look at, what are we doing for our families in situations like this? We're also sending you back at times to live in communities where you are doing things in order to maintain your safety. Kids talk to me all the time about, I'm carrying a gun, not because I want to, but because I don't feel safe here. I'm not joining a gang because I want to be a gang member. I'm joining it for financial stability and for safety. And we all want financial stability and safety. So we can add mentoring programs. I think that's great because it gives you this opening into other opportunities and people who are pouring into you. But we oftentimes go to that so we don't have to address the bigger issue and the systemic issue that's happening. So we have to also make sure we just don't end there.
And I would just say, in order to affect change in these systems, if you are not involved with a board or a committee for any local nonprofit, whether it's your forte or not, get involved. That is where the rubber meets the road, so that you can begin to direct resources as a part of a team, right? And to create programming. That means civic engagement. And as Dr. Dent indicated, and I agree, civic engagement that's non-paid is of the heart. And when it's of the heart, it reaches the heart in terms of those programs so that you can get involved and again, design those programs. I'm a mom of an 18-year-old and I'm on my knees every night because every night I'm afraid. I live in a space of toxic stress with an 18-year-old Black male that's driving around and making decisions about what he's doing, right? And so I try to direct him to programs that I am aware of, and I sit on a number of community organizations, some large, but some small, because it's in the neighborhoods, which is where our children are, so that we can make sure we redirect those dollars and they turn into programs, and the programs provide the principles that our young people will remember. It will stick. They do hear us, even if they push back on us, but we have to be engaged to direct those dollars, and has already been said, to hold everyone accountable for those programs.
Hey, man, let me just add very briefly to that, because what they're saying is so important. These kids already have too many people coming in and out of their life. And you could actually cause more damage to one of these young people by establishing a relationship with them and coming in and out of their life for just a season. When I tell you that some of the kids that I had in rites of passage, like a guy named Rashad, was 14 years old when I first met him. He's 34, 35 years old now, and I'm still his mentor. And he still calls me when he's having a tough time, because I made a commitment to be in his life no matter what. And that's the kind of commitment we need to have, not just more programming.
That's what I told my girls group. We here forever. Y'all ain't getting rid of me. One of the things that I do recommend too is for those who are starting male mentoring programs, there's a curriculum called Dare to be King that's geared towards Black males. It includes a rites of passage portion. It talks about Bring My Brother's Keeper. It even goes into the story of Trayvon Martin and what it's like to engage when in places where you're over policed. So I always tell mentoring programs, specifically in these moments when we're trying to focus on racial trauma, specifically for our Black boys, I've used it and I've encouraged other specifically Black male therapists to use them in their groups. And it's a great resource, specifically when we're talking about these issues. It's on Amazon. That's helpful.
So we, since you're all talking about being parents, we have a question from a parent of 3 teenagers. And she acknowledges that the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, they become very unsettled, and watching all this stuff on TV, and they began to research other cases like the Central Park Five, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, etc. And she says she's tried to have open discussions with them to gauge how it's all impacting them, etc. They appear to be fine, but how would you advise parents to engage in this conversation with their young people, and what signs should parents look for to indicate mental and emotional distress?
I think one of the things is great that you're having the conversations, because sometimes we just choose not to, because we've gotten into this protective, it is what it is, and just keep it moving. So I think it's great that you're having the conversation. I think one of the things, specifically if they're Black boys, is that we have a tendency to tell people to man up and to hold on your emotions. And so part of it is making sure that they're clear that feeling anger, rage, confusion, irritability, annoyance, sadness, depression, anxiety, all of those things, trying to just live is totally understandable. So giving them permission to feel those emotions. I think the things you look for are normal things you would look for anxiety or depression. You look for isolation, you look for increased irritability. So if you have the lovely, respectable child who's always like, yes, ma'am, you're like, what? Then it's time to not snap back quickly, because our first thing is who you, but instead to be like, what is going on? Because something is happening with you. If they begin to engage in behaviors, risk-taking behaviors that they never did before, if they, are hanging with people they didn't before, things that are just out of character are usually the signs we look for. And then to, as a parent, acknowledge, instead of focusing on the behavior, saying this isn't you, talk to me, what is going on with you. Sometimes as women, we also need to find males who we trust to have these conversations, because we can say, be vulnerable, talk to me, and they're like, you don't get it. And so part of it is identifying whether it's a mentoring group, a person in your life that you trust, to also have these conversations with them, take them on a drive, take them on a walk, go out somewhere, just start talking about these things, and have that male disclose to them that this is stressful for them, that this is depressing for them, that also models and gives them permission to be able to still engage in manhood and early manhood, late boyhood, still embody all of that, but understanding that it's acceptable and normal to have those feelings.
Mm-hmm.
A child's brain does not finish developing until they're 25 years old. So one of the things that I will tell you first and foremost is that don't think just because your older children are older that they're coping with this well either, man. I mean, this is very stressful. And as I told you, and I'm one of those type of people that, oh, you don't cry, you're not allowed to cry, man up. And, you know, I was raised the old school, old fashioned way like that. But what I will tell you is that these folks are carrying a tremendous amount of pain. And let me tell you this also, not only is it from what they're seeing on TV, they have friends. If you go into an average room and you ask everybody to raise their hand and say, do you know anybody who has been shot or killed or both? I will tell you a majority of that room of young people will raise their hands. Cleveland is about 50% increase in crime right now in homicides in the city of Cleveland. And nobody's really talking about that because they're focused on this one issue. So that's why I think as a community, we got to multitask. But one of the things that I would just tell you as a parent, just constantly communicate. Every day is going to be a different challenge and a different way of how you have to communicate with your children. Just communicate. That's all I would tell you. Just communicate.
I agree. Communication is essential. I have an 18-year-old son. And so, I made him watch that with me and then just kind of decompress over some tacos with him. It's kind of like, so what you thinking? What's up? Where you at? Because, it's coded. He's not giving me full sentences. He doesn't want to do it. But it's, in those 5-minute bites, or if I hear him reference it, if I walk by his room, because I'm always ear hustling, and I hear him say something, I'm like, so tell me what you're thinking. Like, so I need to know where his head is. And I need to know where his head is because he's operating in a society like many of you that have, in particular, Black boys. I need to know where his head is because I know that this world is cruel. And so whether it's a 2-minute, bites with him or a half hour, it's going to be more like 2 minutes. I need to be able to just like penetrate his mind so that it sticks whenever he's in a situation and he has to reflect on that.
Thank you for that question and panels for answering it. I think probably what the biggest takeaway I've gotten from this conversation, and what I think about when I think about these discussions is, again, that this is just, we're in the middle of a very long journey. And we have to remember that this is a marathon and not a sprint. And so we have to do things to continue to take care of ourselves. We have to make sure that we're keeping the conversations open, whether that's with our children, whether that's with each other in terms of our own groups that make us feel safe and validated, whether it's with others and with allies as we continue to try to move forward. But just remembering that communication and openness and just taking care of ourselves is so extremely important as we continually live in a position of trauma every day. And so again, we really, really appreciate everything that you all are doing on the front lines, everything that you all are doing to continue to bring awareness to these issues and to galvanize people and support to really push this forward as we, again, bring about how important this issue is. So as we come to a close, just wanted to give our panelists a few more moments just to have any last remarks or comments before we end our discussion. And we can start with you, Dr. Dent.
First, I want to thank the ladies of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, my lovely sorors, for this timely topic. My fellow panelists, Chief Minor, Councilman Griffin, for providing perspective, specifically how this looks for us as a public health crisis. For those who are listening, again, this is our lived experience. This is not a moment in time. We are hopeful. I think as a community, we continue to be hopeful that the needle continues to move to a point where when we say Black Lives Matter, that the entire world believes it and honors that, from a framework of recognizing our humanity and not othering us. And until that time happens, making sure that we take care of ourselves, that we engage in multifaceted resistance in whatever ways are suiting to you and that you're capable of doing. Be blessed and always make sure to find moments of joy.
Thank you. Councilman Griffin?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for the, the women and the ladies of Delta Sigma Theta for inviting me to be on this. I realize that I'm the only man on the forum, so I actually feel privileged, to be able that you guys will actually allow me the opportunity to say this. But let me say this to you. This means so much to me. I could just tell you, man, I really care. I really care. I really love this city. I love this community. I love people. And at the end of the day, let's let sincerity and love prevail, because there's going to be so much tension that people have internally and externally, and all these conversations are not going to be as smooth and easy as we're having right now. I would encourage you just to be patient, be tolerant, but at the end of the day, be sincere. What people are lacking right now is what people don't believe is that they have real authentic leadership and people who authentically care about their communities. So I really encourage everybody on this call to really show your authenticity as we deal with this public health crisis, and your voice is definitely needed. And I can't thank you enough for showing your commitment to this conversation.
Thank you, Councilman Griffin.
I just want to thank the sorors of Delta Sigma Theta Incorporated for doing the work that we do. Literally, I love the intersectionality of the two committees. I think that's bold. I think it's courageous to really talk about mental health. It is something that we don't talk about in the Black community, and we need to talk more about it so that we can destigmatize that term and get the help that we need, because truly it is like a jungle sometimes. It makes us wonder how we keep from going under every single day, because every single day we are dealing with and navigating with structural racism and how it impacts us. I just want to leave with a word from President Nelson Mandela. And it's the South African word for humanity, and it's Ubuntu. And that's what we're talking about. We are talking about humanity. And so I certainly give violence to every single sister, every single soror that was involved with this planning. I give violence to our amazing chapter president who continues to lead through uncertainty and change. And I say to every single person that is on this panel and in attendance in this presentation this evening, Ubuntu.
Thank you so much, Chief Walker Minor, Councilman Griffin, Soror Dr. Tiffany Dent. We could not have asked for a more authentic panel for a very deep and critical issue that's affecting our community. Thank you to everyone that joined us tonight. We really appreciate you. You matter. Our lives matter. This will not be the last time you hear from us. We're hoping that this is just the first of a series where we will continue to address social action and mental health issues in our community. I just want to let you know that you registered, so you will receive the slides provided in the presentation. And of course, we need to understand how we can improve or do better. So you will have a survey and a screening tool that you will receive by email. And so I won't take up any more of your time. Thank you to the Social Action Committee and the Physical and Mental Health Committee leaders for pulling this together in a few weeks. And we look forward to seeing you all again. Be on the lookout. Black Lives Matter. Good night, everyone.
Good night.